Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're feeling a little lost about what's been going on in the Middle East, well, you're not alone.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind, that's for sure.
It feels like things have been extra intense the past year or so, and honestly, it's tough to keep up with all the twists and turns.
Yeah.
So that's what we're here for. Think of this deep dive as your guide to not just what happened, but what it all really means.
Because we're talking about some pretty major power shifts here, right? The kind that send ripples through the entire region.
Absolutely. We're talking everything from the Mediterranean all the way over to the Persian Gulf.
No small potatoes.
Definitely not. And listen, we're going to cover a lot of ground. We're talking from that big event that kicked things off back on October 7th, 2023, all the way to today, December 27th, 2024. It's kind of mind-blowing how much can change in just over a year, right?
It really is. I mean, we're going to unpack that whole Israel-Hamas war that was all over the news, of course, but we're also going to look at how that conflict, set off a chain reaction in other places.
Right. Like how Hezbollah got involved, and then that huge shocker with the Assad regime collapsing in Syria.
Lots to untangle.
Buckle up, everybody.
Okay, so let's rewind back to October 7th, 2023. That's the day the war started, as I'm sure most people remember. But I'm always interested in the why behind things. What made that specific date such a turning point?
Well, you got to zoom out a bit to see the full picture, right?
Yeah.
That's the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that's been going on for decades. It's about so much more than just one event. We're talking about struggles over land, identity, power.
Right. So it's definitely more nuanced than just Israel versus everyone else, which is what you sometimes hear.
Way more nuanced.
And speaking of nuances, we hear about Hamas all the time, but who are the other groups involved on the Palestinian side?
Oh, yeah, there are a bunch of different factions there. Besides Hamas, you've got the Palestinian Authority, Al-Tah, and the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization.
Okay, and each of those has their own goals and strategies.
Exactly, which makes the whole situation even more complicated, It's like a game of chess where all the pieces are suddenly making their own moves.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, so then, almost as soon as that war starts, Hezbollah jumps right in. They attack Israel on October 8th, hitting Sheba farms. I mean, didn't those attacks just raise the stakes like crazy?
Absolutely. It was the biggest escalation between Hezbollah and Israel since that 2006 Lebanon war, remember?
Oh, right, yeah.
So that really sent shockwaves through the entire region. Suddenly, it wasn't just about Gaza anymore.
And what's wild to me is that Hezbollah isn't just some random group, right? They've got this whole manifesto from way back in 1985 that lays out all their beliefs and goals.
You're right. That manifesto is key to understanding them. It's rooted in Shia Islam, got a lot of influence from the Iranian Revolution. They talk about kicking out Western influence, getting rid of Israel, and creating an Islamic government.
Wow. Okay, so they want an Islamic government, but they're also, deeply involved in Lebanese politics. How does that even work?
Yeah, it's where things get complicated. See, Hezbollah, they have seats in Lebanon's parliament. They lead a coalition of political parties. And they also command the Lebanese resistance brigades.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It's a lot.
And those brigades, they're not all Muslim, are they? They've got people from different faiths.
You got it. It's a pretty diverse group, actually. Christians, Druze, Sunnis, all fighting alongside the Shia Muslims.
Huh. That is surprising, given how, intense their ideology seems.
It shows you just how multifaceted Hezbollah really is, playing politics, waging war, all while trying to manage that mix of religions within Lebanon itself.
So do you think they got involved in the 2023 conflict to show off their power? Make a statement that they're a big player?
That's a really interesting point. It was definitely a power move. It showed their military strength and how committed they are to the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, you've hit on something really important there.
Yeah.
It's easy to lose sight of the human cost in all of this. We're talking about millions of people whose lives have been totally upended, by conflict, displacement, just hardship in general.
Right. Absolutely.
Those stories are what really matter, to get the full picture.
Absolutely. And speaking of the full picture, we've talked about all these major events, right? The war, Hezbollah joining in, the Israel-Iran escalation, and then the whole thing with Syria's regime collapsing. It's a lot.
Yeah.
But how do we make sense of it all? Is there a pattern here?
Well, what's interesting is that these events, they're not just random, isolated things.
Yeah.
They're all connected. It's all part of this bigger power struggle that's playing out across the whole region.
Okay, so help me unpack that a little. Who are the main players in this power struggle? What are they after? All right, well, you've got Israel. They see Iran as a huge threat. mainly because of Iran's nuclear program and their support for groups like Hezbollah and Hamas.
Right. So Israel sees those groups as like Iran's puppets, basically.
Yeah, you could say that. That's definitely the Israeli perspective. And they've shown they're willing to use force, military force, to counter what they see as Iranian aggression.
But Iran's not just sitting back and taking it, are they? I mean, those drone attacks back in April 2024, that was a pretty clear message.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Iran sees itself as a major power in the region, and they're pushing back against Israel and against America's influence, too, for that matter. They've built up this network of allies and, well, yeah, you could call them proxies, I guess, all across the region.
So they can flex their muscles without always getting directly involved.
Exactly.
And that's where Hezbollah comes in, right? They're like Iran's muscle, basically, keeping Israel busy, making things harder for them.
That's a good way to put it. They can cause a lot of trouble on Israel's northern border, and that makes it harder for Israel to just do whatever they want.
It's like they're all playing this high-stakes game of chess, constantly trying to outmaneuver each other.
Yeah, it is, kind of.
What about the other big players in the region? Like Saudi Arabia, Turkey. Where do they fit in?
Well, that's where it gets even more complex. Their roles are always changing. Like Saudi Arabia, they've usually been aligned with the U.S., right? And they share Israel's worries about Iran.
Makes sense.
But they also really want stability, and they're thinking about their own economy, too.
Right.
So they're trying to walk a fine line. They don't want to get dragged into a direct fight.
And what about Turkey? They're a NATO member, but they've also been getting closer to Russia and Iran, haven't they?
Yeah, Turkey's really interesting. Under Erdogan, they've been charting their own course, trying to balance their goals in the region with what's going on politically back home. They want to stay on good terms with Israel and Iran at the same time, all while trying to establish themselves as a major power.
So it's not as simple as picking sides.
Nope.
It's more like playing multiple sides, trying to come out on top without setting off a whole explosion you can't control.
Exactly. And then you throw in the whole Syrian transition on top of all of that, and it just adds another layer of uncertainty, With Assad gone, there's this power vacuum that everyone's trying to fill.
And that clock is ticking, right? That transitional government, their mandate runs out on March 1st, 2025. It feels like we're just waiting to see what happens next.
It's a tense time for sure. The future of Syria is up in the air, and whatever happens there will impact the whole region. It shows how dynamic the Middle East really is, how one event can set off a whole chain reaction.
It's also easy to forget that in the middle of all these political power plays, there are real people dealing with the fallout.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just think about those 16 people who were killed in that Iranian embassy airstrike.
Right, including that woman and her son.
That's just one example of the human cost of all this conflict. We've seen humanitarian crises in Gaza. We've got all those displaced Syrians. It's a real tragedy.
And even within Lebanon, you can see how these conflicts are affecting everyday life. People are divided over Hezbollah, It shows you how complicated things are, even within one country.
It's a reminder that we have to look beyond the headlines, right? To understand what people are actually going through on the ground.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've painted a pretty intense picture here. The Middle East is like a powder keg, right?
Yeah.
With all these conflicts and tensions just waiting to explode. But I'm also hearing that there's a chance that things could go in a totally different direction.
Yeah, that's what makes the region so fascinating. It's unpredictable, Things are constantly changing, and even small events can have huge consequences. It's a place where conflict and cooperation are always kind of intertwined.
So, given all that, what are some possible scenarios for the future? Like, what are the big what-ifs we should be thinking about?
Predicting the future in the Middle East is always a gamble, right?
Yeah, probably.
But there are some key factors that will probably shape how things unfold, like what happens with the Syrian transition. That's a big one.
Yeah, that March 1st, 2025 deadline is looming, right?
Yeah.
When the transitional government's mandate runs out, what are the most likely outcomes there?
Well, one possibility is that the transitional government, they manage to keep the country together somehow, establish a more inclusive system, start rebuilding.
That'd be the ideal situation, right?
It would be, but it's also the toughest one. Syria is so divided, and then you've got all the outside powers meddling.
So even if they make it past March 1st, it's still going to be a long, hard road.
Absolutely. And then there's the other possibility, which is that the transition falls apart.
Oh, right.
And that could lead to even more violence, maybe even a resurgence of a civil war, different factions fighting for control, That would be a huge setback, not just for Syria, but for the whole region.
And wouldn't that create an opening for groups like ISIS? to exploit the chaos and come back stronger.
It's a real concern. A failed transition could create a power vacuum, and those extremist groups would be ready to fill it. It's a scenario everyone's trying to avoid, but we have to be prepared for it.
Okay, so Syria is a big question mark. What about Israel and Iran? Could they end up in a full-blown war? Is that a possibility?
It's definitely a risk. The tension between those two countries is so high, and then you've got those proxy conflicts we talked about in Syria and Lebanon. It's a very volatile situation.
Good.
Wouldn't take much to set things off, A mistake, a provocation, even an accident.
It feels like walking a tightrope.
It is, and the consequences of a wider conflict would be devastating, no doubt.
So how do we stop that from happening? Is there any way to de-escalate?
Diplomacy is key. The international community has to push for restraint, Encourage dialogue between Israel and Iran. Try to find some common ground. It's not easy, but the alternative is just unthinkable.
And what about the U.S.? They've been the big player in the Middle East for a long time, but it feels like their influence is fading.
Yeah, the U.S. is definitely taking a step back. They're less focused on military intervention these days and more on diplomacy, sanctions, working through their allies in the region.
So less direct involvement, more working behind the scenes.
Right, and that creates opportunities for other powers like Russia and China to step in. We're seeing a shift towards a multipolar world where power is more spread out and the dynamics are much more fluid.
Okay, so we've been talking about all this big picture stuff, geopolitics, but what about the people actually living in the Middle West? What do they want for the future?
Yeah, it's important to remember the human side of all this. People in the Middle East, they're just like people anywhere else. They want peace, they want stability, they want a better future for themselves and their kids. They want good leaders, economic opportunities, education, safety, the basic things.
It's easy to forget about that when you're just reading the headlines.
It is, but that desire for a better life, that's what really matters in the end.
Absolutely. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. I mean, we went deep on the Arab-Israeli conflict, talked about the Assad regime collapsing, and explored all the uncertainties in the Middle East. I have to say, it's a lot to process.
It is a lot. The Middle East is a complicated place, and there are no simple solutions. But hopefully this deep dive has made you curious, made you think critically about the issues and inspired you to keep learning about this region.
It's definitely done that for me. So as we wrap up, I want to leave our listeners with one last thought.
Yeah.
We've talked about all these alliances and rivalries, the power struggles, the human cost. What role do you think each of us can play in creating a more peaceful future in the Middle East? Whether it's through our governments, organizations, or even just as individuals, what can we do to make a difference?
That's the question we all need to be asking ourselves, and there's no one right answer. So we encourage you to dig into those sources we've provided, keep exploring, and form your own opinions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Middle East. We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little hopeful. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.